Equalities, Theresa Villiers.
Question number 1, please, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've introduced an unprecedented package of support for businesses to get through this incredibly challenging period. More than £10 billion worth of grants have been paid, and over 830,000 businesses of all sizes have been able to access more than £34 billion worth of finance through our loan schemes. As of 7th of June, the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme has paid out on 2.6 million applications worth £7.5 billion. Of these, 701,000 claims were from women, totalling £1.609 billion.
Yes.
Can the Minister provide any extra help for women whose new mothers whose periods of maternity leave mean they're either not entitled to help under the Self-Employment Support Scheme, or their entitlement is significantly reduced because of periods of maternity leave?
I thank my right honourable friend for that question. The government clearly understands the challenges for the self-employed in particular arising from the arrival of a new baby or adoption. We're working on additional guidance for those individuals who took a break for work care or to care for a newborn or newly adopted child, and for whom no income tax self-assessment tax return was submitted.
Ruth Capri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 2.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 2 and 3 together. We are taking the findings of PHE's COVID-19 Review of Disparities in Risks and Outcomes report, which was published on 2nd of June, very seriously. The next steps are to fill the gaps in the report, which necessarily had some limitations. The Race Disparity Unit and the Department for Health and Social Care are working with me to do this, and this vital work will help us take appropriate evidence-based action to address the disparities highlighted.
Ruth Capri.
Thank you. So given the delays between publishing a report, publishing the recommendations, and the likely delay now in implementing those recommendations, how does the government propose to rebuild trust and confidence in the government's actions with BAME groups and individuals?
Minister.
I believe the Honourable Lady is conflating 2 different reports. There was no delay in publishing the first report, which did not have recommendations. The second report was published by PHE just yesterday, and many of the recommendations are already in train. But I refer her to the written ministerial statement I laid yesterday, which hopefully should provide additional clarity on that.
Dr. Curran-Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I may, I want to begin by paying tribute to the very many BME staff I've worked alongside in the NHS, including in recent months. They're an absolutely vital part of the NHS team, which is why it's really important that we get this review right, and it's crucial that we get the necessary expert advice to help us do that. Can the Minister inform the House of the steps she's taking to get that expertise to support the work she's undertaking?
Minister.
I do agree with my honourable friend. We are determined to proceed with this in an evidence-led way, and we will be engaging with experts in the field. On Friday, the Minister for Public Health and I held a virtual roundtable on these issues with a number of public health consultants and leading academics in this field, including Professor Michael Marmot. I'm very grateful for their input, and we intend to continue in this spirit by engaging with other experts, such as the ONS.
We now go to Shadow Minister Marcia de Cordova. Marcia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Professor Fenton's report, finally published yesterday, highlights yet more evidence that socio-economic inequalities, racism, and discrimination are root causes to BAME communities being disproportionately harmed by COVID-19, and that these injustices were already known and has already cost lives. The government's denial and delay further compounds despair at their lack of care and concern. The 7 practical recommendations the government should have taken much sooner include risk assessing our Black and minority ethnic workers on the front line. Black Lives Matter is more than just a slogan. So what immediate and decisive action will the Minister take now to develop and deliver culturally competent occupational risk assessment tools?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I refer again to the ministerial statement which was laid yesterday, which does cover this. The government did not delay publishing any reports, and recommendations which were published, most of which the actions are already in train, can be seen on the gov.uk website.
Laura.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Scully.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is committed to helping all employees during this challenging time. The Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme is an unprecedented scheme to protect employment. It's supported more than 9 million jobs. As always, equalities legislation requires that employees must not discriminate based on gender or pregnancy and maternity in the workplace.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have found that women are 47% more likely to have permanently lost their jobs since the start of the crisis and 15% more likely to have been furloughed. We know that social distancing has severely impacted hospitality, leisure and retail, where women are disproportionately employed in customer-facing roles. What steps can my honourable friend take to ensure that women do not emerge as the accidental casualties of the crisis?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for particularly highlighting the situation with hospitality and leisure, which I speak to many of the people in that sector on a daily basis. We're actively monitoring the impact of COVID-19 on the labour market, but it's too early to draw any firm conclusions. Equality legislation, as I said, requires that employees must not discriminate based on gender, and this law continues to apply.
Heading to South Yorkshire with Jill Furness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As with any other economic downturn, it is women at risk of being worst hit by the economic consequences of coronavirus. As childcare responsibilities overwhelmingly fall on women, the closure of schools and childcare facilities could leave many women forced to leave work or reduce their hours as the furlough scheme is wound up. The U-turn yesterday on free school meals is welcome and will help many families. But what is the Minister going to do to ensure that women are able to return to work in a flexible way in order to balance childcare commitments and not lose out financially, particularly as schools are not yet fully open?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for that question, and it's important that we do manage to supply childcare, and that's why women should be able to go to their local authority. They may not get their first choice in childcare provisions, but their local authority will be able to guide them. Nonetheless, flexible working remains the case, that if you can work from home, you should be able to work from home, and employers need to be mindful of that.
Craig Triss.
Question number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the government's Rose Review into female entrepreneurship found that 250 billion of new value could be added to the UK economy if women started and scaled businesses at the same rate as men. And we must take the opportunity as we recover from the COVID crisis to help make this happen.
Craig Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I recently highlighted to my right honourable friend that very point about the 250 billion. And as part of that solution, I've been working to try and deliver a set of women's business hubs across the UK, which I know is something that the British Library are also working on. So what other steps can my right honourable friend take to ensure that as part of the COVID recovery, it benefits women across the UK and encourages more female entrepreneurs?
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend as his work for the APPG on women and enterprise. He's absolutely right. We need to make sure that this is a cross-UK phenomenon as part of our levelling up agenda. We've got growth hubs across the country. We're working on mentoring schemes, and we're also working to make sure that investment is available right through the UK to help those start-up businesses get going.
Select Committee Chair Caroline Doe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has shown real passion and commitment to female entrepreneurship, which is going to be absolutely crucial as we seek to recover from COVID. But unfortunately, those same women will not be able to start up their own businesses, or they won't be assisted to go back into the wider workforce unless they can have reliable, accessible, available childcare. What specific discussions is she having across government to make sure that that childcare is available, whilst we recognise that there are challenges around social distancing, around the hours that schools can operate, and can she please enlighten us on what she's doing?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right about the vital importance of childcare, and we also need to make sure that the flexible working practices that have developed during this COVID crisis are available to both women and men following the crisis. We are making sure that educational settings are open as soon as possible. Over 90% of nursery schools and colleges were open on the 4th of June. And I'm working very closely with Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, and his Minister to make sure that we reform childcare to make sure more places are available.
Owen Thompson.
Question 6, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Bednar.
No one should face discrimination. Individual departments and their ministers must take account of the equality impact of their policies, and I can assure the House that my ministerial colleagues take this very seriously. Across the whole of government, we have already taken significant steps to tackle the sorts of concerns raised by the Black Lives Matter movement, continuing to act on the Lamy report, working to improve trust between citizens and police forces, and ensuring record numbers of ethnic minority people continue to go to university.
Owen Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 2 weeks, we've heard members of the government, including the Prime Minister, repeat that Black Lives Matter, yet the policies fail to reflect that. The Unity Project's report presented the Home Office with evidence that the no recourse to public funds policy discriminates against black British children and leaves them growing up in poverty. What steps can the Minister take to protect BAME groups and black people in particular against further discrimination to ensure that the UK Government's words are actually matched by their actions?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The issue around no recourse to public funds has been raised multiple times, and there are many things that the government is doing to tackle issues where people who may not necessarily have been able to access public funds can do so. One of the things, for example, is ensuring that anyone who needs treatment in the NHS is not having to be charged to do so, but also schemes such as the coronavirus job retention scheme are actually still available to people who have no recourse to public funds.
SNP spokesperson Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister agrees that some racism is down to unconscious bias, and something that could make a real difference is to help people recognise and address their own bias. If she agrees, will she welcome the creation of the APPG on unconscious bias, which will conduct a number of investigations starting with racial bias, and will she commit to working alongside us and consider any recommendations with an open mind?
Minister.
Yes, I think that's something that I can definitely agree to. Thank you.
Christian Whitford.
Question number 11, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary Truss.
Mr. Speaker, conversion therapy is a vile and abhorrent practice we want to stop. We've commissioned research to look at the scope of these practices in the UK, and when we receive that research back, we will publish our plans shortly.
Christian Whitford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for her words on this abhorrent practice. Will my right honourable friend consider taking steps specifically to protect those under 18 from conversion therapy?
Secretary Truss.
I'm particularly concerned about under 18s being coerced into so-called conversion therapies, and that is one of the specific points that we will be addressing when we launch our plans shortly.
Alexander Stafford.
12, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government takes the public sector equality duty into account when developing and implementing and reviewing all policies, including the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're gathering and developing evidence on the equalities impact of COVID-19, which we use to support and influence planning for economic recovery.
Alexander Stafford.
I thank Ms for the answer. Flexibility of working is important both for men and women. So can my honourable friend tell me if BEIS have plans to make flexibility the default rather than an optional issue?
Grateful to my honourable friend for raising the issue about flexible working. The government's been clear about the benefits of flexible working for employees and for their employees. The manifesto that we stood on talked about the Employment Act, which we will be working on and we will bring to this place when possible, which will make flexible working the default. Subject to consultation, we're looking forward to introducing those measures.
We now come to a substantive question from Debbie Abrahams and Minister Mims Davis to answer the substantive.
Committed to ensuring the benefit system is effective and positive in supporting disabled people. This includes a number of measures such as suspending face-to-face assessments, extending PIP awards and, where necessary, suspending PIP awards where necessary, increasing the Universal Credit Standard Allowance and local housing allowance rates.
Heading up to Oldham with Debbie Abrahams. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that people with existing health conditions are more likely to become seriously ill and to succumb to COVID-19 than the population as a whole. For example, more than 1 in 4 people, of all people who've died of COVID in hospital in England, also had diabetes. So what assessment has the government undertaken of the proportion of people with health conditions in receipt of social security support who've also died of COVID?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for raising a really important issue, and DWP does look to identify and learn lessons very swiftly, and the Minister for Disabled People is having extensive engagement conversations with charities and stakeholders on exactly these kind of issues so we can understand the impact on the most vulnerable.
Peter Gibson.
14, please, Mr. Speaker.
State.
Mr. Speaker, we want LGBT people across the world to be free to live their lives without discrimination and persecution. I'm working closely on this with the Foreign Secretary, and today, as we launch trade negotiations with Australia, I'm delighted to have worked so closely with High Commissioner George Brandis, who played a leading role in Australia's legalisation of same-sex marriage, and we will continue to work with close allies to lead the world in this issue.
Peter Gibson.
I thank my right honourable friend for that answer. In the month of Pride being celebrated around the world and looking forward to the rescheduled Global LGBT Conference being hosted here under the chairmanship of the Right Honourable Nick Herbert, does she agree with me that it is essential for us to deliver on our 2018 LGBT Action Plan in order to preserve our place as a co-chair of the Global Equal Rights Coalition?
Well, can I take this opportunity to wish everybody the very best wishes for a happy Pride, and I'm sure we'll be doing a lot of things virtually rather than on the streets, but it's very important we celebrate this, and I'm delighted that we're hosting the LGBT conference on the theme of Safe to Be Me. In response to my honourable friend's question, we are going to be updating our plans for LGBT rights for 2020, and we want to continue to lead the world in this issue.
Substantive question, Kate Griffiths. Minister Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All NHS organisations continue to make appropriate arrangements to support their ethnic minority staff, and NHS HR directors are considering a range of mitigating actions, including redeploying staff into alternative roles, stringent fit testing procedures, equity of PPE provision and training, and improved occupational health support. For those in other key roles, government has issued safer workplace guidance, which emphasises the need for employers to carry out risk assessments, to engage with their representatives, and to take account of equality impacts.
Heading up to Burton with Kate Griffith. Kate Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Burton and Uttoxeter, we have sadly lost a number of dedicated frontline workers from the Black Asian minority ethnic community. My constituents are understandably worried, and I've raised concerns previously in the House about how we can protect those in at-risk groups who work on the front line. Public Health England's recent stakeholder engagement work contains a number of recommendations. Can the Minister give an outline of government's progress on these?
Many of the stakeholder recommendations are already in progress, as she states. And as part of existing government work, we're collecting better data on ethnicity. That was one of the recommendations. We agree that this is imperative, and we're working to overcome technical barriers. On occupational risk assessment tools, NHS employers have published some excellent frameworks and tools which can be used now. On communication, the Race Disparity Unit is working on this with COVID teams across departments. And on further research to fill the gaps in PHE's review, that's something which I have said is one of my immediate priorities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 16.
Minister Davis.
The government is committed to supporting disabled people through the COVID-19 outbreak and beyond. We continue to monitor its impact on disabled people and those with a health condition, using existing and new data sources to improve our understanding.
I thank the Minister for her answer. Many people with disabilities and parents of children with special educational needs and disabilities have contacted me feeling very fearful that they will face abuse for not wearing a face covering on public transport. Labour supports the use of face coverings, but the government's messaging needs to be very clear. Will the government ensure that its public advertising campaign does include and explain the exemptions and look at supporting local charities who are trying to address this?
I thank the Honourable Lady for raising this point, and we do need to recognise that some people with disabilities face particular difficulty when it comes to social distancing and are impacted by the reaction of others due to their inability to socially distance, and I understand particularly young children. I would like to reassure the Honourable Lady the Department for Transport has revised transport guidance for travellers and operators and considers the details needed for disabled travellers, and I hope that reassures her.
Rick Kellyfoy.
Mr. Speaker, in March, government removed... question 17. Mr. Speaker, to ease the burdens on businesses due to coronavirus, we suspended enforcement of the gender pay gap reporting in March. Despite this, over 5,500 companies have reported to date, and employers continue to do so.
Rick Kellyfoy.
Mr. Speaker, the gender pay gap reporting was removed in March, but despite this, just 2 weeks before the deadline, only around half the businesses expected to report did so. This cannot become a lost year for narrowing the gender pay gap. Eliminating pay inequality, especially for those women in low-paid, insecure work, must be at the heart of the recovery. Can the Secretary of State tell me exactly when gender pay gap reporting will be restored and how this information will be used as part of the coronavirus recovery? Mr. Speaker, we are in a serious economic situation due to COVID, and my priority has been, as Women and Equalities Minister, to make sure that women stay in employment where possible, are able to get jobs where possible, and that is where I'm putting all of my efforts.
We now come to Topicals with the first one from Neil Gray, Secretary Truss.
Mr. Speaker, as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, this government will ensure everyone has the opportunity to succeed. That's why the Prime Minister announced we are setting up a new commission on race and ethnic disparities. And that's why we will be hosting an international LGBT conference once international travel allows. We will work to support businesses to maintain some of the positive changes we've seen, such as greater flexible working, which benefits women, men and their families.
Heading to Scotland with Neil Gray. Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of that answer, I refer the Secretary of State to the latest report by the Social Mobility Commission highlighting that for a third of its recommendations, there was little or no action by successive governments in the past 7 years, including on ensuring that child poverty is not exacerbated by universal credit, which received the lowest red rating based on evidence showing that 72% of children living in poverty live in households where at least one adult is in work, and BMA children are more likely to be in poverty. Given the total lack of leadership by her UK government highlighted by this report, will she take ownership so that her government finally step up and ensure this report and the millions of children in poverty are not ignored?
I think we've got the question.
The most vital tool in social mobility is education, and that is why we are absolutely determined to get children back to school, to support children through lessons virtually who aren't in school, and I would encourage the Scottish Government to follow the leadership we're showing here.
Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nobody's chances in life should be limited by the colour of their skin or their ethnic background. What progress is the Prime Minister's Race Disparities Commission making, and when might we start to see results?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and he touches on the point on why the government has set up the commission to understand why disparities exist, what works and what doesn't, and present recommendations for action across government and other public bodies. It should report by the end of the year.
Returning to Battersea with Marcia de Cordova. Marcia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government ran a consultation on the ethnicity pay reporting that closed back in January 2019. Nearly 18 months on, the government has failed to publish a response to this consultation, and twice in replies to written questions on this issue, they say that something will be published in due course. This is not good enough. Mandatory pay gap reporting will be one small but significant step towards addressing pay equality. So when will the government finally publish its response to the consultation and take urgent action to introduce mandatory pay gap reporting?
Mr. Speaker, pay gaps are caused by a range of factors. The Honourable Lady is right that we ran a consultation on this issue in late 2018, and I will write to her to provide her with an update.
Sherilyn McCraw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in celebrating the good news that the so-called rough sex gone wrong defence will now be outlawed?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. It was a disgrace that this was being used as a defence in cases of criminal cases of murder, and I pay tribute to members across the House who have run an effective campaign, and I congratulate the Ministry of Justice for taking action on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased the Prime Minister is in the wings to hear this, because we know that the disclosure and barring scheme bars people sometimes for decades from work, and frankly is unfair and discriminatory. We know that the Windrush scandal is still ongoing, and there's dither and delay in the Home Office. And we know that in the health and care services that there has been disproportionate impact on those from BME communities, especially amongst women in nursing and care roles. We don't need another commission to decide this. What we actually need is some action. What's the Secretary of State going to do about it?
Well, the honourable gentleman does make a fair point about the barring service. It is something we are looking at, but it's important we look at this across the board, and that is why we have set up the Commission.
Mr.
Speaker, a short question. Being out of school really impacts on children's opportunities. Can the Minister commit to getting every single child back to school in September?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. It's vital we get our children back into school. My right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, is working very hard on this. We are doing everything we can to make it happen.
We now come to the questions to the Prime Minister, and we are going to start with Martin Doherty-Hughes. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and I shall have further such meetings later today.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
The journey of Munira Mirza from the pages of the Srebrenica denying living Marxism and the Revolutionary Communist Party into the heart of Number 10 has not gone unnoticed, Mr. Speaker. On a Monday, the Prime Minister appointed them to lead the Commission, the Government's Commission for Racial Inequality, and it was greeted with some disbelief given their well-known views on the matter. So I wonder, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister tell us today, does he agree with Ms Mirza that previous inquiries have fostered a culture of grievance within minority communities?
Mr. Speaker, I am a huge admirer of Dr. Munira Mirza, who is a brilliant thinker about these issues, and we are certainly going to proceed with a new cross-governmental commission to look at racism and discrimination, and it will be a very thorough piece of work looking at discrimination in health, in education, in the criminal justice system. And I know that the House will say we've already had plenty of commissions and plenty of work, but it is clear from the Black Lives Matter march and all the representations that we have had that more work needs to be done. And this government is going to do it.
We're now heading up to Yorkshire to visit Andrea Jenkins. Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the disgraceful events of the last week, with thugs defacing national monuments, including Churchill and Queen Victoria, and offending the memory of hero PC Keith Palmer, what will the Prime Minister do to uphold British values and carry out the rule of law? Thank you.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and as I can tell her, I can tell the House any incident of vandalism or attack on public property will be met with the full force of the law, and perpetrators will be prosecuted. And I can also confirm that we are looking at new ways in which we may legislate against vandalism of war memorials.
We now come to Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the announcement of a major breakthrough in the treatment of coronavirus by UK scientists? That's really fantastic news, and we're all behind it, and I want to pay tribute to all of those involved. Can I also welcome the Prime Minister's latest U-turn, this time on free school meals? That was the right thing to do, and it's vital for the 1.3 million children who will benefit. It's just one step in the fight against child poverty. A report last week from the government's Social Mobility Commission concluded that there are now 600,000 more children living in relative poverty than in 2012. The report went on to say child poverty rates are projected to increase to 5.2 million by 2022. What does the Prime Minister think caused that?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for what he said about dexamethasone, and I'm glad that he's finally paying tribute to the efforts of this country in tackling coronavirus. But I can tell him that on free school meals, this government is very proud that we set up universal free school meals, and I'm very pleased that we are going to be able to deliver a COVID summer food package to some of the poorest families in this country, and that's exactly the right thing to do. But I must say that I think he's completely wrong in what he says about poverty. Absolute poverty, relative poverty have both declined under this government, and there are hundreds of thousands, I think 400,000 fewer families living in poverty now than there were in 2010.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says poverty is not increased. I've just read a direct quote from a government report, from a government commission produced last week, which says it's gone up by 600,000. The Social Mobility Commission has a clear answer to my question. This anticipated rise in child poverty is not driven by forces beyond our control. I gave the Prime Minister the number, 600,000. He didn't reply. The report goes on to say, and this is a real cause for concern, and the Prime Minister's chuntering, you might want to listen. Real cause for concern, because the Commission goes on, I'm sure the Prime Minister's read the report, that it's even... They are really concerned that these projections were made, 5.2 million, before the impact of COVID-19. And they go on to say, which we expect to push more families into poverty. This is a serious issue. I'm sure the Prime Minister would agree that an even higher child poverty rate would be an intolerable outcome from this pandemic. So what's he going to do to prevent it?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I've just understood what the Right Honourable Gentleman is talking about, what he calls an anticipated rise, rather than a rise that has actually taken place. I think a new concept is being introduced into our deliberations. What we're talking about was what has actually happened, Mr. Speaker, which is a reduction in poverty. And I can tell him that, of course, we are concerned. And the whole House will understand that, of course, this government is deeply concerned about the impact of coronavirus on the UK economy. But I think everybody with any fairness would acknowledge that this government has invested massively in protecting the workforce of this country. 11 million jobs protected by the coronavirus job retention scheme, unlike anything done anywhere else in the world. £30 billion worth of business loans, and we intend to make sure that we minimise the impact of coronavirus on the poorest kids in this country. And one of the best ways in which we could do that, by the way, Mr. Speaker, would be to encourage all kids who can go back to school to go back to school now, because their schools are safe. Last week I asked him whether he would say publicly that schools were safe to go back to. He hummed and he hawed. Now's his time to say it clearly. Schools are safe to go back to. Mr. Speaker, your witness.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister obviously hadn't got the first idea what the Social Mobility Report actually said last week, a government body. And he talks to me about consistency and U-turns. The government's had 3 U-turns in the last month. First we had immigration health charges, then we had MPs voting, and then we had free school meals. The only question now is whether U-turns at the dispatch box before or after. 3 U-turns. He argues about one brief one week and one the next. He's an expert in that. Mr. Speaker, this isn't the only area where the government are falling short. During this pandemic, local authorities have been working flat out on social care, on homelessness, obtaining protective equipment for the front line, delivering food and essential supplies. On the 26th of March, the Community Secretary told council leaders directly and in terms, this was a letter to council leaders and a speech, the government stands ready to do whatever is necessary to support councils in their response to coronavirus. Does the Prime Minister believe that the government has kept that promise?
Mr. Speaker, we'll put £3.2 billion extra into local government to tackling coronavirus. But I must say, we didn't hear an answer, did we, Mr. Speaker? How can he talk about tackling the effect of coronavirus on the most disadvantaged? It's the most disadvantaged kids, Mr. Speaker, who need to go back to school, and it is those groups which, unfortunately, at the moment are not going back to school. Let's hear it from him for one more time. Will he say that schools are safe to go back to? Come on.
Mr. Speaker, this is turning into opposition questions. If the Prime Minister wants to swap places, I'm very happy. We could do it now. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, the only bit of an answer he gave was about £3.2 billion to the question I asked. Well, it's a lot of money. The Conservative-led local government authority said that they're going to have a shortfall of £10 billion this year. The Health Secretary heckles. The Conservative leader of Lancashire County Council wrote a letter to the Community Secretary a month ago on the 7th of May. And he said this: the overall financial impact on councils nationally and locally will be far in excess of the £3.2 billion provided to date. He went on to say, we would like some assurance from you that all councils will be fully reimbursed for the costs of COVID-19. These are the Prime Minister's own council leaders. He must have known about this problem for months. Why has he been so slow to act?
We haven't, because in addition to the £3.2 billion, we've already put another £1.6 billion to support councils delivering frontline services, plus another £600 million, from my memory, to go into social care. And the reality is, Mr. Speaker, I really want to return to this point about poverty. We want to tackle deprivation in this country. I want kids to go back to school. The unions won't let him say the truth, which is that schools, a great ox has stood upon his tongue, Mr. Speaker. Let him now say that schools are safe to go back to.
Prime Minister.
I spoke, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister just doesn't get how critical this is. I spoke with council leaders across the country this week. They face a choice. The Prime Minister must know this, between cutting core services or facing bankruptcy under Section 114 notices. Either outcome will harm local communities and mean local services can't reopen. That will drive up poverty, something the Prime Minister says he doesn't intend to do. Local councils have done everything asked of them in this crisis. The government hasn't. Will the Prime Minister take responsibility and actually do something?
Well, Mr. Speaker, with great respect to the right honourable gentleman, I've outlined what we are doing to support local government, and I think that this country can be very proud of the investments that we have made. I think, by the way, that they can be very proud of the incredible work that local government officials have done across this country. But I must say there are some councils, and particularly Labour councils, alas, that are not opening their schools now when they could be opening their schools. And I say to him now, I hope the last time, now is the moment when he can say to those Labour councillors that it is safe for kids to go back to reception, to year 1, to year 6, to early years as they can. Will he now say it?
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, every week the Prime Minister seems to complain that I ask him questions at Prime Minister's questions. If he wants to swap places, so be it. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to return to the Prime Minister's other recent U-turn, the immigration health surcharge for NHS and care workers. Following Prime Minister's questions on the 20th of May, the government announced that it would drop this deeply unfair charge. That's nearly a month ago. Nothing's happened. The BMA, the Royal College of Nursing, the Royal College of Physicians and UNICEF have all written to the Prime Minister, so he must know about this. One doctor was quoted on Monday as saying, my colleagues who've applied, even yesterday, one of them said he had to pay for himself, his wife and his 4 kids, that's £6,000. He says the Home Office is saying that nothing has been implemented. These are people on the front line. The Prime Minister said he would act. When's he going to do so?
I'm genuinely grateful for an important question, because it is vital that people who are working on the front line and NHS workers in particular get the support that they need. And that's why I said what I said a few weeks ago. And what I can tell him is that NHS or care workers who have paid the surcharge since the 21st of May will be refunded, and we are getting on with instituting the new arrangements as fast as we possibly can.
Leonici.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Prime Minister's rejection of the extension to the Brexit transition period. Can I ask him if he agrees with me that taking back control of our fishing waters in January 2021 will benefit the fishing communities within the Great Grimsby constituency?
I can tell my honourable friend that it certainly will, and we are going to become once again an independent coastal state. And I know how brilliantly she campaigns for fisheries in Grimsby, and I would urge her to engage with DEFRA to make sure now that the people of Grimsby can exploit the recapture of our spectacular natural marine wealth.
Heading to Scotland, to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Marcus Rashford has shown more moral leadership in tackling poverty in a matter of days than this Tory government has in the past decade of cuts. But as he says, people are struggling all year round and more needs to be done. This morning, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Save the Children have published research showing the ongoing health crisis is causing 6 in 10 families to borrow money, 7 in 10 to cut back on essentials, and over 5 in 10 falling behind on rent and other essential bills. Mr. Speaker, an extra £20 a week in social security support would prevent millions of families from having to make the choice of paying their bills or feeding their children. Will the Prime Minister now immediately uplift the child element of universal credit and child tax credit by £20 per week?
Mr. Speaker, this is a government that has done everything that we possibly can so far to help families in need, to make sure that nobody is penalised for doing the right thing during the crisis, because I know how difficult it has been. That's why we uprated the universal credit by £1,044, benefiting, I think, 4 million families in this country. But I say in all sincerity to the right honourable gentleman that we are fully aware that there will be tough times ahead, and we do stand by to do more where we can.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. £20 a week. £20 a week to help families with children. That's what we are asking for. We're talking about an extra £20 a week to stop families having to make the choice between paying their bills or feeding their children. That's the harsh reality, Prime Minister. This is a question of helping people survive. This Tory government has seen a decade of austerity that has driven people into poverty, that has scrapped child poverty targets. Rather than reversing the damaging policies that have pushed millions into poverty, the Prime Minister is more interested in finding money to spend on his own vanity project, a luxury VIP plane. Is he seriously saying that he won't find £20 a week to help families who are struggling to survive?
No, of course not, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're investing massively in universal credit, in employment support allowance, in benefits across the board, to say nothing of the novel schemes that we have introduced, such as a coronavirus job retention scheme, which is a model that I think the whole world is admiring. There's no other country that has put its arms around 11 million workers in the way that this government has, supported jobs, supported incomes across the whole of the UK. We're going to get this country through it, and I hope he supports our measures.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, with the Social Market Foundation, I published my report titled Unlock Britain, which sets out 10 reforms that the government can put in place to help our economy recover once the health crisis is behind us. Would the Prime Minister agree to work with me and consider some of these ideas, in particular my idea of a recovery fund for British small and medium-sized businesses, indeed small and medium-sized businesses from the entire United Kingdom, to help reduce their debt burden and give them equity so they can power our recovery forward?
I've studied my honourable friend's proposals with interest, and he is an expert in what he speaks of, and we will certainly look at all kinds of ways, imaginative ways, in which we can stimulate a strong rebound, a strong economic recovery, and he should stand by for what the Chancellor is going to be announcing in the next few weeks.
Sir Edward David.
Mr. Speaker, due to the COVID crisis, tens of thousands of British businesses face bankruptcy. Millions of British people face redundancy. So in Britain's hour of need, will the Prime Minister put the practical imperative of saving jobs before his Brexit ideology, rather than risking a bad deal or a no deal due to the deadline set before coronavirus? Why doesn't the Prime Minister, so some good old-fashioned British common sense, give our economy the chance to breathe and accept the EU's offer of a delay?
Well, I've just put it to the right honourable gentleman that there is another way of looking at it. And well, the first point, I think the people in this country are just heartily sick of going on about Brexit, and they want to get it done. We got it done. We're going to move forward. So, the other point is when we come to the end of the transition period, we will be able, Mr. Speaker, to do things differently. We will be able to respond to our economic needs in a creative and constructive way, looking at regulation, looking at ways in which we support industries in a way that we haven't been able to do before. That will be very productive for this country. Let's not delay that moment. Let's get on with it.
Definitely Clifton Brown.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure everybody will be delighted that my right honourable friend is back in this House in such robust form. He will be pleased to know that almost 50% of the children in Gloucestershire who qualify are back at schools now, but their education has suffered over the last few months. Would he consider, therefore, doing two things? Firstly, to ask all teachers to set all their children and pupils a catch-up plan before the summer? And secondly, would he ask all head teachers to get a recovery plan so that everybody can go back in September?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and that's absolutely crucial that we do that. There's a big catch-up plan that my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, is going to be announcing very shortly. It's vital that kids get the catch-up on the education that they have lost, but even more vital, as I think I may have mentioned to the House already this morning, that the kids who can go to school should go to school. And wouldn't it be a fine thing, Mr. Speaker, if we heard from all sides of the House that schools are safe to go to, rather than the wibble-wobble that we've heard from the opposition this morning?
Heading to South Wales with Jessica Morden. Jessica Morden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A strong UK steel industry is essential for the UK's economic recovery. Plants like Llanwern and the Orb Steelworks in Newport, the only electrical steel plant in the UK, can play a key part in that recovery. But 3 months into this crisis, and steel companies are still waiting for government liquidity support, it's critical. Will the Prime Minister commit to address this now?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable lady, because we take this issue in the UK steel industry very, very seriously. We're doing everything we can to maintain UK steel production, though clearly it was always facing difficulties even before Corona struck. I will make sure that I look at the particular needs of the concern that she raises in Newport East, and we will ensure that we do everything we can. I just remind her that we've supported 9,200 workers in her constituency through the furlough scheme.
Sloane Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Coronavirus has underlined the importance of improving broadband infrastructure. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that extending the existing relief on business rates for new full fibre infrastructure could see the release of the investment we need to level up rural areas like North Devon? And will he thank telecommunication workers for their efforts during the pandemic?
Absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. And, that's why we've provided 100% business rate relief for all new fibre investment, and I'm very happy to join my honourable friend in thanking the amazing work of the telecommunications workers who've kept going, many of them throughout the pandemic, to put in that broadband infrastructure. I thank them with her.
Christian Matheson.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has previously stated to the House that he had no correspondence or discussions with the Secretary of State for Housing and Communities about the Westbury Printworks application. Will he now also confirm that none of his officials or advisers also had such correspondence or discussions with the Secretary of State for Housing and Communities or his officials and advisers? And will the Prime Minister undertake to publish all correspondence relating to this matter when the Cabinet Secretary reports?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I certainly had no correspondence about this matter with myself, nor, as far as I'm aware, did any of my officials. But if there is anything to be said, I know that I think the right honourable gentleman has written to the Cabinet Secretary, and he will be writing back.
Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reopening of non-essential shops in Aylesbury on Monday has been a very welcome boost to restart the local retail sector. Can my right honourable friend assure me he'll do everything necessary to stimulate the rest of the Buckinghamshire economy in the weeks and months to come? For example, easing restrictions on outdoor tables and chairs, cutting unnecessary regulation, and perhaps most importantly, providing a dedicated stimulus for our small businesses, the businesses for which the county is rightly renowned.
Yes. I thank him. I thank him for the way he campaigns for business in Aylesbury and in his constituency. What we will be doing is obviously doing what we can to flex the social distancing rules, but only as we make progress in driving the incidence of the virus down. I think everybody understands the tension that the whole country is operating, the trade-off that we have to operate. We must continue to defeat that virus, but we are sticking to our plan. We will stick ruthlessly to our plan to continue with opening of hospitality sectors on July the 4th at the earliest, and proceed on that basis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, in response to a question from the member for Lewisham Deptford, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Newly shielded people may be asking themselves whether they'll be entitled to furlough funds. I have been made aware of the issue very recently, and I can assure her that we'll be addressing it forthwith." But since then, the deadline for applying for the furlough scheme has been and gone, and there's been no announcement about the support for shielding workers. So could I ask the Prime Minister, is this yet another U-turn, or has the Prime Minister just forgotten what he said in the Chamber last week?
No. No, Mr. Speaker. The furlough scheme should be available for everybody.
We go to the gallant gentleman, Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's really good to see the Prime Minister looking fighting fit. Can I ask my right honourable friend where we are in the process of trying to stop repeated vexatious claims against servicemen and servicewomen who have been involved in fatality shootings in the Northern Ireland campaign?
Yes, I thank my right honourable friend, and he's absolutely right, and we are going to be bringing forward legislation that focuses on protecting people who've been involved, whether victims or veterans alike, ensuring equal treatment in Northern Ireland for our veterans and also for those who have served overseas.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A million people with no recourse to public funds can't access the universal credit safety net. I agree with the Prime Minister's point at the liaison committee that hard-working families in that position should have help of one kind or another. So will he deliver help? Will he suspend the no recourse to public funds restriction for the duration of this crisis and do it before the school summer holidays so that destitute families can at least claim the free school meal vouchers he announced yesterday?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course they should be eligible for those, but already those those who have no recourse to public funds do have access, as I said to him repeatedly in this chamber, to coronavirus job retention scheme, self-employment income support scheme, the measures that we've introduced to protect renters, the mortgage holiday for those who need it, and when an individual has been working for long enough in the UK and enough national insurance contributions have been made, they may also be entitled to employment and support allowance. So it is, although no recourse to public funds sounds as though it means there is just that, it is a term of art. There are many ways in which we support the poorest and neediest in this country. We're proud to do so, and we will continue to do so.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome efforts by companies like Facebook to make the internet a safer and less misleading place? But I know my right honourable friend will agree that we cannot leave online platforms to regulate themselves. So can I urge him to allow no further delay in the bringing forward of the government's response to the online harms white paper consultation and legislation which will enable this country to play the global leadership role on this it can and should play.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, and I know that he's campaigned on this issue, and I remember the interest that he's taken on in online harms. They're an evil. There is a real risk during the lockdown that terrible things have been going on behind closed doors, closed curtains in this country on the internet. We had a summit on the matter in Number 10 recently, and we are working at pace, as he knows, on new legislation against online harms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As if BA's behaviour hasn't been bad enough, an agency in their supply chain short-term did not pay staff during COVID, claiming they're waiting clarifications from HMRC about furlough. The workers then couldn't access benefits and have now been made redundant after 10 weeks of zero income. Will ensure HMRC clarifies matters and considers an extension to the furlough deadline, but also if short-term are found to be bluffing, what's he going to do to stop companies treating workers like numbers in a spreadsheet?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am concerned about the behaviour of some companies, and I think that many colleagues around the House will have received similar representations from their own constituents. I don't want to single any out, but it is very important that companies recognise the government, the taxpayer, has gone to huge lengths to help to put our arms around UK business. They should do what they can as well to look after their workers in very difficult times, because those workers will stand them in good stead when the economy turns up again.
Jonathan Gillis.
Mr. Speaker, in Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork, I have the incredible Chatley-Whitfield colliery. Once the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution, Chatley is now sadly at risk of being lost. Will my right honourable friends support me, Stoke-on-Trent City Council, Historic England and the Friends of Chatley-Whitfield to protect and preserve this historic landmark by creating an industrial heritage park to stimulate tourism, create new green jobs and memorialise the history from the pits to the pots?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my honourable friend and the Friends of Chatley-Whitfield colliery for the ambition that he has just outlined for a heritage park. I think it's a proposal that he needs to work up in more detail and bring to the government. We'll certainly look at it with interest.
25 has been withdrawn by Amy Callaghan. I'm sure all the House pass on our best wishes and looking forward to a speedy recovery and the return to the House. We now come to Julie Marson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that as our country emerges from this crisis, we have an opportunity to be bold in putting innovation at the centre of our response, to support high-growth sectors such as green energy and fintech, and also to use innovative financial solutions such as social impact bonds as a tool in delivering our levelling up agenda?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. She may not believe it, but when I was Mayor of London, we pioneered social impact bonds to tackle the most entrenched rough sleepers, to give value to companies for their success in dealing with this terrible problem, and to charities. And I'm proud to say that those social impact bond schemes are now being used in 7 projects across the country to tackle rough sleeping. We've made huge progress in dealing with rough sleeping. It's a scar. The number of rough sleepers has been a scar, Mr. Speaker, on our consciences. It has got much, much better over the crisis, but we must make sure it does not recur. Forgive me, Mr. Speaker.
No problem. Final question, Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beef farmers in my constituency produce a high-quality product in which consumers can have confidence because our farmers can demonstrate lifelong traceability of their cattle. Their efforts, however, are undermined by labelling legislation in this country, which allows beef from anywhere in the world to be labelled as British beef as long as it is packaged in this country. If the Prime Minister is serious about maintaining food standards, especially in light of any future trade arrangements, will he do something to close that loophole?
Well, yes, Mr. Speaker, and if what the right honourable gentleman says is indeed the case, and I'm sure that he knows exactly whereof he speaks, I can only say that it must be one of those things that is currently governed by the laws of the EU, to which he is bound to return an independent Scotland should that catastrophe ever arise. And, Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House intend to take advantage of the freedoms that we have won, and that the freedoms that the British people have decided to take back, to make sure that Scottish beef farmers do have the protections that they need.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safer arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Point of order, come after. Jonathan Ashworth.
To ask the Secretary of State to update the House on COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the chance to update the House on the urgent matter of coronavirus. Yesterday's treatment breakthrough shows British science is amongst the best in the world, Mr. Speaker. And as a nation, we can be incredibly proud of our scientists. The UK is home to the best clinical trials, the most advanced immunology research, the most promising vaccine development work of any country. And we've backed the science from the start, and I'm sure the whole House will welcome the life-saving breakthrough that was announced yesterday. Today, if I can, Mr. Speaker, I'll briefly update the House on all three aspects of that scientific national effort. First, on clinical trials, our recovery programme, which looks at the effect of existing treatments in real-world hospital settings, is the largest of its kind. As of yesterday, 11,547 NHS patients had been recruited to the programme, which is operating across 176 sites in all 4 nations. In Oxford University's dexamethasone trial, over 2,000 NHS COVID patients were given a course of this drug, a commonly used steroid, over 10 days. For patients who were ill enough to require oxygen, the risk of dying fell by a fifth. And for the most seriously ill patients on mechanical ventilators, the risk of dying fell by over a third. This is an important moment in the fight against this virus. It's the first time that anyone in the world has clinically proven that a drug can improve the survival chances for the most seriously ill coronavirus patients. In February, we began the trial, supported by £25 million of government funding. In March, we began recruiting the patients and started the process of building a stockpile in case the trial was successful. And I can let the House know that as of today, we have 240,000 doses now in stock and on order. And this means that the treatment is immediately available and already in use on the NHS. I'm incredibly proud that this discovery has happened right here in Britain through a collaboration between government, the NHS, and some of our top scientists. It is not by any means a cure, Mr. Speaker, but it is the best news we've had. Throughout this crisis, our actions have been guided by the science, and this is what good science looks like. Randomised control trials, rigorous, painstaking research, moving at pace, yet getting it right. And the result is that we now have objective proof, not anecdote, but proof, that this drug saves lives. And that knowledge will benefit many thousands of people all around the world. 7 other drugs are currently being trialled as part of the recovery trial. And a further 9 drugs are in live clinical trials as part of the Accord programme, which is looking at early stage treatments. We look forward to seeing the results of all these trials too. And I want to thank everyone involved and put on the record my thanks to our Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Jonathan Van Tam, who's led the work in government, the NHS clinicians, the scientific teams, and, of course, the participants in the trial who took the drug before they knew that it worked. Mr. Speaker, our immunology research, again, is world-leading. Last month, I announced a new antibody testing programme to help us understand the immunological response to the disease, whether you get resistance to coronavirus once you've had it and recovered. I myself am part of that programme, and as of yesterday, 592,204 people have now had an NHS antibody test. The nature of immunity research is that it takes time. You have to wait to see if someone with antibodies gets reinfected. But with every test, we improve our picture of where the virus has been, and we grow the evidence to find out if people who've had the disease and have antibodies are at lower risk of getting or transmitting the virus again. Crucially, this work will help inform how we deploy a vaccine. My final point, Mr. Speaker. That work is moving at pace. Earlier this week, Imperial College began their first phase of human clinical trials. 300 participants will receive dosages of the vaccine, and should they develop a promising response, Imperial will move to a large phase 3 trial later this year. And yesterday, AstraZeneca signed a deal for the manufacture of the Oxford vaccine, AZD1222, which is the world's most advanced vaccine in development and whose progress, while never certain, is promising. Mr. Speaker, none of this happened by accident. It's because the British government, scientists and the NHS have put in place a large-scale, programmatic, comprehensive, well-funded, systematic, rigorous, science-led system of research and innovation. We've been working on it since the moment we first heard of coronavirus. There is more to do in this national effort, but this is how we win the battle. We will leave no stone unturned as we search for the tools to hunt down, control and ultimately defeat this dreadful disease.
Can I just say to the Secretary of State, he's gone way over the allocated time. What I would have preferred, bear with us, it would have been easier to have made a statement than having to have a UQ. In future, if we could come forward with a statement, if you need the extra time, I will certainly grant and support you in doing so. Some extra time to Jonathan Ashworth as well, and to Philippa Whitford. Jonathan Ashworth.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, can I welcome the news from the Secretary of State about dexamethasone? This is, as he said, an important moment. It is good news. I want to congratulate all involved, and it is a reminder that we can be immensely proud of our science base in this country. I note what he says about vaccinations. We know a vaccine is absolutely crucial. I hope he will join with me, as I'm sure he will, that in saying that when a vaccine is available, we must have no truck with those who spread poisonous anti-vax propaganda on social media, because vaccinations save lives, and ultimately it will be the exit strategy from this dreadful, horrific disease. Now, the good news is tempered, of course, by the high death rate. The Prime Minister likes to boast of flattening the sombrero, and it is certainly true that deaths and hospitalisations are coming down, but we've still had 58,000 excess deaths across England, 13,000 in care homes, 300 health and care staff have sadly lost their lives. But all our NHS staff deserve great praise, don't they, Mr. Speaker? So can I just ask him on a specific point which has emerged in the last couple of days? Why are student nurses who joined the front line 6 months ago as part of the coronavirus effort now seeing their paid placement schemes terminated early, leaving them with no income? Surely this is no way to treat student nursing staff. Now, the World Health Organization has this week warned the UK remains in a very active phase of the pandemic. And he will accept if a second wave comes, especially if it coincides with flu season, that would be completely disastrous. Can he reassure the House that the decisions that he and the Prime Minister are making around easing lockdown measures, such as the mooted relaxation of the 2-metre rule, the opening of retail, non-essential retail this week, will not precipitate a deadly second wave of the virus? Could he update us on the latest thinking on that front from the Department of Health? In the past, he said he's prepared to institute local lockdowns, but local authorities continue to say they do not have the resources or the powers to enforce it. Can he update us when he will take powers or give powers to local authorities to enforce those lockdowns? Yesterday, the Health Service Journal said that those in the shielding group, that their shielding will come to an end at the end of July. We were promised a full update on shielding on the 15th of June, 2 days ago. Can he update the House now? What is happening, or what is the future for the shielding group in terms of them getting their medicines and supplies, and whether they'll be able to leave their homes by the end of July or not? We have always said that testing, tracing and isolate is crucial to safe easing from this lockdown. So on testing, local authorities say they are still not getting the specific test data that they need. And indeed, the Deloitte's contract, it was confirmed in a written answer from the Minister for Mental Health, that the contract never specified that they need to report their test results to GPs and local directors of public health. Surely we need to fix that. Why is he still not publishing the numbers of people tested? And can he explain something that is puzzling a lot of us? On the figures, the tracing figures he revealed, which we're grateful for, it suggested 8,000 people went into the contact tracing system in England. Yet, during that week, the government testing figures said there was around 12,500 positive cases in the UK. Even if we make an assumption for how many of those cases are in England, that still suggests there's around 2,000, maybe 3,000 cases not being traced and contacted. Can he explain why is that and what he's going to do to fix it? Finally, we have now seen the Public Health England recommendations into the impact of COVID on those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. These recommendations are welcome. Many of them, such as mandated ethnicity data collection and recordings on death certificates, should have been done years ago, for example. But when will these recommendations actually be implemented? When we know, for example, that black people are nearly 4 times as likely to die from COVID as white people, and when over 90% of doctors who have died during this pandemic have been from black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, surely this now is a matter of urgency. We cannot wait. We need those recommendations implemented straight away.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will try to answer as many of the questions as I can. Firstly, I concur with him entirely that we should have no truck with any anti-vaccination campaigners. The reason that we're working so hard with full-blown clinical trials on these vaccines is to ensure that they're safe. And if they're declared scientifically safe, then anybody recommended to have one should have one. He makes a case on student nurses. It is wrong to suggest that student nurses and midwives are being made redundant. All student nurses and midwives are required to complete placements during their training. As part of the response to COVID-19, these hours have been paid and will be until the end of the summer, and NHS England has been provided with the funding for student salaries as part of our response to COVID-19, and the chief nurse has taken that forward. He makes the point about local authorities getting data. We have provided more data to local authorities, and we will continue to do more. He asks about the steps that will be taken in future. All I'd say to him, in terms of lifting the lockdown, all I'd say is, as ever, we will move carefully and cautiously. Thankfully, all of the main indexes, all of the main ways that we measure this disease are all moving in the right direction. We are winning the battle against this disease, but we will be careful and cautious in the next steps that we take. We're working very closely with local authorities on local lockdowns. He specifically asked this point about powers, which he's asked before. We have the powers, I have the powers under the Coronavirus Act passed by this Parliament, Mr. Speaker, and if those powers are needed by local authorities, then they will, and there is a process to raise that requirement up through a command chain that leads to a gold command, which I chair, and then those powers can be executed on behalf of the local authorities if they're needed. He asked about shielding, and we will bring forward the proposals for the next steps on shielding very shortly. And finally, Mr. Speaker, he asks about the positive cases that don't go into the NHS test and trace scheme. This is largely because they're inpatients in hospital, and therefore testing and tracing in the normal sense doesn't apply, because we know exactly where the person is and who's been in contact with them because they've been in hospital in a controlled environment. That is the case for the large majority of that gap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On that last point, 20% of the people with coronavirus in hospital are estimated to have caught the virus whilst in hospital. So will the Health Secretary tell us when he plans to introduce weekly testing of all frontline NHS and care home staff as a way of bridging the gap, the still very significant gap between the number of people that we test and trace and the number of people actually getting the infection every week?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The chair of the Select Committee makes an incredibly important point. The approach we're taking is a targeted one of repeat testing, which is started already but needs to spread much further. The reason is that some people in hospital settings are at higher risk, and it's better to focus the resources for repeat testing on those in higher risk. For instance, somebody working in finance might be in lower risk than somebody in a frontline setting. But the NHS has a strategy on this, and I will write to him with further details of how that's going to work.
We're now heading to the SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford, with some extra time. Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too welcome the positive outcome of the recovery trial showing the contribution of dexamethasone, a drug which is cheap and accessible across the world. However, despite claiming to be well prepared for this epidemic, the Secretary of State has struggled to provide sufficient PPE to NHS staff in England. He has now awarded £350 million of PPE contracts, but can he explain why 108 million of that was awarded without being advertised to Crisp Websites Limited, which trades as PestFix, a small pest extermination company? Why was such a large contract awarded to a company with no expertise in trading or supplying any PPE, let alone highly specialised equipment for NHS staff? And how does the government think such a small company with only £18,000 of registered assets, can manage the cash flow required to procure £108 million of PPE? Is this not just a reprise of the seaborne freight scandal, the ferry company with no ships?
No, Mr. Speaker. We have enhanced, under the leadership of Lord Dighton, the supplies of PPE across the whole United Kingdom. I work very closely with the SNP government on this matter, and we've made sure that PPE is now available in large part across the whole NHS and social care and all those others who need it. Demand for PPE rose exponentially in this crisis across the world, and it was difficult for a time, Mr. Speaker. There's no point denying that, but we have made huge strides in ensuring that we now have long-term contracts in place, and I'm really glad that the supply and distribution of PPE is much wider.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate the Secretary of State on his science-led strategy that we're now reaping the dividends from, and it's genuinely saving lives. But the science also tells us that as you reduce the propensity of the virus in the population, you can also reduce the social distancing that you applied. And businesses, residents and teachers across Arundel and South Downs are united in their appetite to move to 1 metre as quickly and as carefully as possible. Perhaps the Minister could update us on that.
Well, the answer is that we keep all of our non-pharmaceutical interventions, as they're called, the NPIs, the social distancing measures. We keep all of our social distancing measures under review. The 2 metre rule is another social distancing measure in the same way that other parts of the lockdown have been. It's the sort of thing that, of course, we want to lift, and we need to do that in a way that is careful and safe. And so the scientists are reviewing it along with the economists, and we will take forward the further measures on this when it's possible and safe to do so.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, I declare an interest as the Vice Chair of the APPG on pancreatic cancer. And my colleague, Vice Chair, is the Honourable Lady for East Dunbartonshire, that you referred to, Mr. Speaker, earlier on. I'm glad to report, after discussions with and talks with other members, that she is showing some improvement very clearly, Mr. Speaker, to you and me, an answer to prayer. Secretary of State has been made aware of the concerns of the leading cancer charities when we understand that it's estimated that 2.4 million people are awaiting cancer screening due to the delays caused by lockdown, part by lockdown. But can he outline his intention to implement the 12-point plan of recovery backed by 24 cancer charities, including pancreatic cancer?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm incredibly grateful to the cancer charities for the work they're doing, highlighting the importance of coming forward, people coming forward for screening, because that has been part of the problem, and to make sure that we get these the screening programmes back up and running in the full sense as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend confirm, though we reached the peak of the transmission later than other areas, the virus is in decline in the Midlands, and my constituents in Stoke-on-Trent are safe to go out and shop and can do so as long as they follow social distancing guidelines?
Yes, that's right, Mr. Speaker. In the Midlands, as in other parts of the country, this virus is abating. The number of cases is coming down, and that is good news. And that means we're able to relax some of the social distancing measures. For instance, on Monday, saying that it is perfectly safe for people to go and shop, and the shops can open so long as they do so in a COVID-secure way. I'm glad to say the vast majority of shops have been very careful about how they've reopened, making sure that that social distancing is in place, and therefore it is safe to shop in the West Midlands and the rest of the country.
Lily Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 6 people in the UK have a hearing loss and rely on lip reading and facial expressions to communicate. So the use of face coverings, whilst important for controlling the virus, is a real barrier and risks increasing misunderstanding, anxiety and isolation, of course, particularly the case where they're used in hospitals. What's he doing to accelerate the development, testing, production and use of clear panel face masks, including for clinical settings? And more immediately, will he support a public awareness campaign on good communication tactics?
Yes, I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to raise this. It's a really important consideration, and I've been talking to audiologists in the NHS about what we can do to try to make sure that you have the least negative impact as possible. Obviously, a face covering has an impact on people who are lip reading. It's an unfortunate but entirely natural consequence of wearing a face covering, and everything we can do to mitigate that, I'm up for doing.
Heading to Harlow with Robert Halfon. Robert Halfon.
Remarkable consultants, doctors, nurses, support staff, domestic workers of Princess Alexandra Hospital in my constituency of Harlow have saved and nursed back to health over 270 patients from this awful coronavirus. Will my right honourable friends pay special tribute to the workers at Princess Alexandra Hospital, the management team, and also just confirm that because of the pressures on that hospital, that we will get our new hospital and a new site as soon as possible?
Secretary of State.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Gentleman is the greatest friend that there is to the Princess Alex Hospital in Harlow. He's campaigned on it absolutely rigorously, ruthlessly, too, since he was first elected. I firstly want to pay tribute to all of the staff, frontline staff and the support staff who've worked so hard at the Princess Alex through this crisis, and pay tribute to their service. And secondly, I will want to reconfirm that we will rebuild the Alex and we'll make sure that it is a world-class hospital.
Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the recommendations from the now fully published Public Health England report into the impact of COVID-19 on the BAME community is that the government should look to reduce health inequalities, and fast. This is something that the Welsh Labour Government is taking seriously, with a comprehensive risk assessment for black and minority ethnic workers devised by Professor Kishar Singhal being rolled out across the NHS in Wales. This risk assessment is simple to use, produces clear outcomes and will save lives. So can the Secretary of State outline exactly how and when a comprehensive risk assessment will be implemented in England to protect our BAME communities and prove that black lives really do matter?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is quite right to raise this important issue, and we are rolling out a risk assessment across England for all of those with a higher risk of suffering from coronavirus, including the BAME staff in the NHS in England, who do so much to keep the service on its feet.
Heading to Stoke-on-Trent with Joe Gideon. Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The impact of coronavirus has been significantly greater in less affluent areas such as Stoke-on-Trent Central, where 1 in 4 children has free school meals. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that tackling the health inequalities in constituencies like mine is essential if we are to make progress on the issue of inequality of opportunity?
100%, Mr. Speaker. The need to level up is no greater than in the levelling up of health inequalities, and the differences in life expectancy between different parts of our country is stark and has been laid bare further by this crisis. The crisis has been like sheet lightning that has laid a light on some of the health inequalities that have been there before, but must with increased urgency be addressed. And that is one of the big learnings from this crisis. It's something that we all knew before, but we redouble our efforts to resolve after this crisis is over.
Bentley.
Speaker, last Friday it was confirmed that the UK is eligible to participate in a European scheme to place advance orders for vaccines currently under development, and also to ensure priority access to any successful vaccine. Can I ask the Secretary of State what is his assessment of the potential merits of UK participation in such a scheme?
Well, we are having such discussions, and I've had conversations with my German and French counterparts and my Italian counterpart on exactly this subject. However, the most important thing is we will not let those discussions get in the way of the much more advanced discussions we've got directly with the vaccine producers to make sure that even if the two great British vaccine hopes don't come off, and one from the rest of the world comes off first, that we've got that one, we've got access to that vaccine for citizens right across the UK.
Scott Mann.
You're asked, Mr. Speaker. It's fantastic news for the whole country that Oxford University have successfully trialled this drug to reduce mortality rates by up to a third for COVID patients on ventilation. Can my right honourable friend confirm that this will be made available soon so the people of North Cornwall can benefit from that as part of the wider NHS?
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to say that because we made the stockpile in advance, this treatment is already now in place as of yesterday afternoon in Cornwall, in Treliske Hospital and right across the country.
We're going to Scotland with Peter Grant. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any reduction at all in social distancing guidelines inevitably carries with it a risk of increasing the spread of the disease. So can the Secretary of State give an assurance that before any reduction is announced by the government, he will publish his assessment of the public health and transmission and infection rate implications of any such change?
Mr. Speaker, I am legally obliged by the Act that governs this area of policy to undertake such a review before those changes are made.
Robert Lager.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The drug trial breakthrough is fantastic news that's going to save a huge amount of lives. And it's great news, as he just gave in his answer now, that the drug treatment is already available on the NHS. Coming to the vaccination trials, it's great that Britain is leading the world. But this is a global problem. What steps are we taking to work with vaccination trials across the world from other countries so that we can get a vaccine as soon as possible?
Well, this is a really important point, and not only do we contribute more to the global vaccination funding programme than any other country, and we hosted the Gavi Summit, which raised over £8 billion for global vaccine research. But also with the 2 British vaccine candidates, we are engaged with other countries, in particular the Oxford one, because it's so much further advanced and is the most advanced in the world and the soonest hope for a vaccine, touch wood, should it come off. None of these things are certain. And so not only have we secured early doses here in the UK, which yesterday it was confirmed are being manufactured, and the contract was agreed between AstraZeneca and the manufacturer. But also AstraZeneca are now engaging with countries right across the world, both in Europe, the United States, where they've already signed a deal, and elsewhere, in order to ensure that should that vaccine work, it will be available globally.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All of us who grew up in Wythenshawe are very proud of Marcus Rashford today, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with the Health Foundation that people facing the greatest deprivation have a higher rate of exposure to COVID and more severe outcomes when they contract the virus? Wythenshawe residents are twice as likely to die than those in neighbouring areas.
Yes, I do. I pay tribute to Marcus Rashford, and I think that the way that he's conducted himself in this, making the argument that he has just been absolutely brilliant. You know, last night, Mr. Speaker, I was reading my son Harry Potter, and it was clearly still stuck in my mind at 7 o'clock this morning when I started out on the TV. We all make errors sometimes. I apologise to Marcus for getting his name wrong on one occasion. I have no possible reason for having made that mistake. But what really matters is the brilliant campaign that he's done and the volunteering that he's done all the way through this crisis.
Sir John Rabbit.
It's great news that steroids can save some lives, and a tribute to those involved. But as the Secretary of State has said, there's still many people who aren't going to get a treatment that works. And he said that there are 7 other treatments in test, which presumably started at a similar time, from different groups and families of drugs with different impacts. When will we know the results of those?
Mr. Speaker, the answer is as soon as possible. The trials will also look at whether, in combination with dexamethasone, now that we know that that is so effective, these drugs improve, save lives. But the way that the clinical trials work is that we will keep them in trial until we know rigorously, to a point of scientific proof, that they work. And then as soon as that point is met, then we will roll them out. So that point was met on Monday. I was told on Monday night about this success. Because we'd stockpiled in advance, that meant we could announce immediately and immediately make the change through the NHS. So I don't have a date because it's all driven by the science.
Sarah Sultana.
Mr.
Speaker, the government's handling of coronavirus has been marked by complacency. Complacency led to NHS cuts and PPE stockpile shortages. Complacency led to a delayed lockdown, the disaster in care homes, and the neglect of test, track and trace. We have one of the highest death tolls in the world, and scientists say tens of thousands of deaths could have been avoided. So will the Secretary of State end this complacency, put public health before private profit, and ease lockdown only when it's safe to do so?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we will, of course, only ease lockdown when it's safe to do so. But I thought, if you listen to this statement, the whole point of the case I was making is that right at the start we put in place the science and we started the stockpile and we gave the scientists the support and the funding so that they could deliver on this sort of research that we have led the world on and delivered ahead of anybody else in the world.
18 withdrawn. Emma Lewell-Butt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Despite this virus being with us since January, it took till mid-April for the government to issue guidance for routine testing to take place prior to discharging into care homes. It remains now that regardless of having the virus or not, homes are still expected to take residents. Every single week I speak to distressed staff and heartbroken families. Over 16,000 people have died in our care homes. Does he accept any responsibility for this?
Well, I accept responsibility for everything that happens across the health and social care piece, and it is incredibly important to work with care homes as we have and to fund care homes as we have to put in place infection control. And of course, being in hospital is also not a safe place if you don't need to be in hospital. And so the infection control procedures are there now with the funding in care homes. And this has been the case since the start, since well before the date that she mentioned. The thing is, Mr. Speaker, although this challenge in care homes has been very significant, we have seen, thankfully, in this country, a lower proportion of the overall fatalities from this disease in our care homes than across the rest of Europe. And that is a good thing, but it isn't to say that there haven't been some very significant challenges.
John Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What further examination of the potential use of cotrimoxazole has taken place, and when will we know the results of that?
Well, cotrimoxazole is another prospect that we are looking at, but again, as with the answer, I'm afraid, to my to our right honourable friend about the timing has to be driven by the science. As if we get success, when a clinically a result that the clinicians have scientific confidence in can be met, that we will stick with the clinical trial methodology that leads to concrete results. Too many other places around the world have pulled clinical trials early because of promising results that have turned out not to be well-founded.
Heading to Scotland with Dr. Lisa Cameron. Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Fawcett Society have completed an important report addressing mental health issues in women with disabilities during this pandemic. I'm particularly concerned as chair of the Disability All-Party Group that they find anxiety and isolation in over 50% of respondents. So will the Secretary of State increase funding to mental health providers with a view to helping disabled people access the specialist support that they so crucially need?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady asked an important question. We have been increasing funding to mental health services, and it is an incredibly important part of this response. I would say that our mental health services across certainly across England, the area for which I'm responsible, have risen admirably to the extraordinary challenge presented by coronavirus, and I pay tribute to their work.
Boris Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I represent a number of aerospace manufacturing companies, and of course the whole sector is very hard hit at the moment, and are particularly worried about the impact of the 14-day quarantine. He will know far better than I would know, but is it not possible to do very simple temperature checks on people as they come into this country?
Mr. Speaker, I have looked into this in great detail, and I'm afraid that I am advised, and I've been persuaded by that advice, that this will not work, and it has been tried in other parts of the world, and they find that the number of false positives is very high, meaning that you end up quarantining more. And the number of false negatives is also very, very high. So you find very, very few of the people who you're looking for. So I'm afraid it isn't a recommendation that I feel that I could make on the current evidence that I've seen.
Ben Bradshaw.
Which are the countries in Europe that have a higher infection rate than us and that we are protecting ourselves from with his blanket quarantine policy?
Well, the first thing is that, of course, any new infection that is coming to this UK, I would rather not see. And the second point, on a point of policy, is that the approach that we're taking is to ensure that we protect this country from the incidence of disease coming in from abroad, and also that we look at travel corridors where we can be confident that we can have that travel without re-importing the virus.
24 is withdrawn, so we're going to Scotland with Miriam Fellows. Miriam Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The CEO of the Nuffield Trust has written that even if a second wave is prevented, resuming routine hospital primary care and dental services will be all but impossible without a vaccine. The Minister will be aware that losing these vital services will simply lead to lives being lost to a variety of other causes. So what discussions has he held with healthcare professionals on a medium to long-term strategy to allow vital services to resume under the changed conditions of the new normal?
Yes, this is an extremely important point, which is that infection prevention and control within the NHS, which is absolutely vital, also leads to constraints on how the NHS can operate, and it's one of the main things that we're worried about as we get the NHS restarted.
Larry Kruger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating the British Army units based in my constituency in Wiltshire for the support that they've given to the NHS in coping with this crisis on logistics and building the Nightingale hospitals and so on, but also welcome the new spirit of collaboration and openness by the NHS itself, which has shown a great willingness to collaborate with other parts of the public sector. And can we hope that that might be sustained in future?
Yes, it must. I agree with my honourable friend very strongly on both counts. The Army and all of the armed services have played a huge role in responding to this crisis on the logistics, on the delivery of testing, on the building of Nightingale hospitals right across the UK, and much, much more. And the NHS has worked like never before with organisations, public and private, out with the NHS. And that culture of openness, of porous borders, and of working collaboratively with councils, with the armed services, with private companies, and with the rest of government has been an absolutely huge step forward for the NHS, and one that we should never take back.
Going to South Wales with Geraint Davies. Geraint Davies.
Mr. Speaker, research from Harvard and Queen Mary's University clearly shows a dramatic increase in the level of death and infection from COVID-19 in higher pollution areas. Given that BAME communities do tend to live in higher pollution areas, will he firstly accept that this is a major factor in their disproportionate death rate? Will he say what he's doing with colleagues to ensure that we have a low pollution rate as we come out of COVID? And will he meet with me to consider proposals from scientists, from businesses, from academics and local authorities published by the All-Party Group on Air Pollution to look at a strategy of coming out of lockdown with low air pollution to reduce death and infection rates?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend when it comes to air pollution, he and I share a passion for clean air. And he's right about the point about deaths being correlated with areas of high air pollution. We are looking at the reasons behind the disproportionate number of BAME deaths, and we will take air pollution into account in that work. And on the final point, it's a bit like the question on it from a completely different angle from my honourable friend on this side. previously, there have been some things that have got better in this crisis. Overall, the crisis, of course, has been terrible, but there have been some things that have got better. One is that air pollution has got better, and let us cling on to that and redouble our efforts to keep clean air for the future.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the COVID crisis, the relaxation of constraints on data sharing has enabled my local hospital, Stepping Hill, the local council, Stockport Council, and other bodies such as CCG and partners to work together. And the information sharing that they've been able to do has given a better service to patients. In the light of that, is this something we could take forward? And perhaps a report could be commissioned by the Health Department or the NAO to look into the benefits of enhanced data sharing?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. This is a third question in the row on some of the benefits that we've learnt about during the coronavirus crisis. We made clear that data sharing rules should not get in the way of treatments that can improve and save lives. And we made that clear at the start of the crisis. It has had a hugely positive impact on the capability of people both to treat individuals and to do research, and we will not be going back on that. The one-pager that we put out to the whole NHS on how to manage information governance that keeps information secure, but does so in a way that doesn't get caught up by some of the old, out-of-date data protection rules that had been followed, will stay, and indeed I hope to strengthen it in order that data can be better used right across the NHS.
Colonel Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Honourable Member for giving us the update. Groups like Links Counselling in my constituency report that referrals for children and adolescent mental health services are down as much as 50% in some areas during lockdown period. The Honourable Member will agree that this is very, very concerning. Therefore, can you outline what recent assessments have been made regarding the impact of COVID-19 on children and young people's mental health, specifically the impact of schools closures, and what steps you will be taking alongside the devolved regions to address this vital issue?
Mr. Speaker, this is a vital issue, and the Honourable Lady is quite right to raise it. We've got to make sure that we have the mental health services and people crucially come forward for support for their mental health if they need it. We have found in paediatric mental health that that telemedicine, i.e. treatment and psychiatry over a screen, can in fact be more effective than face-to-face treatment, because it's easier to do it in your own home rather than have to go through the worry and concern of travelling. That is an interesting and important finding, and we've got to make sure again that we seize those benefits, as well as of course ensuring that people come forward and the availability of mental health treatment is there.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Buckinghamshire and the South East, A&E activity is still down around 22%, and cancer referrals are running at about 60% of the baseline average. Will my right honourable friend join with me in sending out a clear message once more that if people think something is wrong, that they need medical treatment, our incredible NHS is open and they should seek the help they need?
Yes, the NHS is open, and we need people to help us to help them by coming forward, especially if they have a fear of cancer or of heart disease or stroke. Any of the predictive signs of a much more serious illness. Now, on A&Es, what we have seen a decline, a very sharp decline in the number, and we want to see people who need emergency treatment coming forward, but the sharpest decline has been of the people with the lowest acuity problems who may be able to find healthcare more appropriately elsewhere. So people should also consider carefully whether they really need to go to A&E, and instead it may be beneficial to call 111.
Or if they've got one. Chris Brown.
Further to that question, there are two other aspects of the coronavirus lockdown. One is that lots more people are using bicycles, and that has led to a very significant increase in the number of head injuries, in particular to children who aren't wearing helmets. Some areas are reporting the total number has exceeded this year already, the number that they had the whole of last year. And secondly, a lot more people in the open air and in the sun, lots of them not covering up and getting sunburn, which is a real danger for future skin cancers. So can the Secretary of State please start two specific pieces of work? One on skin cancer and making sure that we get the right message out about covering up in the sun, and secondly, about wearing a helmet and looking after people who've had brain injuries.
Yes, I'd be very happy to write to the honourable gentleman about what we can do in these two areas, which I know he's campaigned very hard on. The one thing I would say on the positive side is over the past few months, the early signs are that the likelihood of dying as a 5 to 14-year-old has been the lowest probably ever, because it has been much safer in lockdown, because far fewer road traffic accidents, for instance, and because the likelihood of dying from coronavirus as a child is very, very, very low. So it has overall been a safe time if measured by that ultimate measure of how many children have died, much lower than usual, which is a good thing, but he's quite right to raise the points that he does.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 10,000 people in the UK, including my wife, suffer from cystic fibrosis. Coronavirus adds a significant risk to CF patients who already have a limited life expectancy. CF sufferers and their families were offered a significant lifeline when the Secretary of State agreed to fund the life-saving drug Orkambi last year. But there's a new drug called Trikafta that has been granted a licence in the US. This is a wonder drug that will extend the lives of CF patients. The father of Sarah Jane Lilliman from Eastwood in my constituency, who sadly passed away a few years ago, has asked if the Secretary of State can assure the CF community in the UK that he will do all he can to make sure this drug is available and extend the lives of thousands of people.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will do absolutely everything I can. I didn't know that my honourable friend's wife suffered from cystic fibrosis. I'm absolutely determined to make this happen. I worked really hard with the CF community to land Orkambi. I was very proud when we managed to do that, and thank goodness we did that before coronavirus struck, because for many it was literally a lifeline who caught coronavirus. But Trikafta has great promise, and to be able also to treat almost all CF sufferers, as opposed to about the half that Orkambi successfully treats. I have been working on this even during the crisis, and I really, really hope we can make some progress.
Heading to Scotland, to Margaret Farray. Margaret Farray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On May 5th, the first trial of the NHS COVID-19 app started on the Isle of Wight. Since then, information on the app's development has been scarce, and it has been beset by delays. Media reports suggest that the app has had technical problems with accurately estimating distance between phones, which is worrying as the app is intended to expand contact tracing in England. When will the Health Secretary publish the results of the pilot and outline his plans for a wider rollout of the app?
Those reports were wide of the mark, and that the app doesn't have a problem with measurement of distance, but I will come forward with an update very soon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The staff at Epsom Hospital and the Epsom and Helier Trust have done a fantastic job in recent weeks dealing with the virus. The Secretary of State will know that this is one of the trusts that has a provision allocation of funds to build a new hospital in the area. I am particularly concerned that before final decisions are taken on exactly how that money should be spent, that lessons from the pandemic are learned, that any changes that need to be made as a result of what we now know may be needed for future hospital services are taken into account. Can he give me an assurance he'll make sure that happens?
My right honourable friend is an incredible campaigner for Epsom Hospital. I think the injection of approximately £500 million into the local health economy will be a very welcome step. We've absolutely got to ensure that the lessons of COVID are learnt before the new development goes ahead. But I would commend all those staff at Epsom and St Helier Hospital for the work that they've done. In some cases in that hospital, really very difficult work under great pressure, and the leadership of the Trust who have done a fantastic job.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State didn't actually answer the question from the member for Central Ayrshire, so I thought I'd give him another chance. Of the £350 million of PPE contracts, can he explain why £108 million of that was awarded without being advertised to Crisp Website Limited, which trades as PestFix, a small pest extermination company, Why was such a large contract awarded to a company with no expertise in trading or supplying any PPE, let alone highly specialised equipment for NHS staff? And how does the government think that such a small company with only £18,000 of registered assets can manage the cash flow required to procure £108 million of PPE?
Mr. Speaker, when the demand for PPE shot up as it did, not only here but around the world, we worked with so many companies to deliver extra PPE, and we have managed to deliver on what was needed, and that's why we have now the medium-term supply chains in prospect. And I pay tribute to all of my commercial team who did extraordinary things and sometimes innovative things in order to make that happen, and that's what they did.
So Desmond Swett.
From the very beginning, clinicians in every developed country in the world have thrown the entire contents of the medical cabinet at this disease in the hope of finding something that works. To what does he attribute the success that he has reported today?
I attribute the success to great British science, government-supported funding, the NHS, and the three working together. And it is British ingenuity in our brilliant university base, combined with the funding that we put in right at the start, combined with the fact that with the NHS you can get easy access to a very large patient base, that means that we have the biggest clinical trials in the world. And crucially, Mr. Speaker, when we were under pressure and others around were saying, you know, hydroxychloroquine is going to solve all your problems, we stuck with the clinical trials, we stuck with the science, and we have successfully delivered this one treatment, not a cure, a treatment, but it is a good stride down the road.
Vera Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State mentioned earlier that with regards to student nurses who were taken on 6-month extended clinical placements back in March, that he would continue to pay them until the end of the summer. Could you just clarify for the House that means the full 6-month contracts will be honoured, because many of these nurses gave up other paid jobs and will be left in hardship if they do not have their contracts honoured?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The statement that I read out in response to the question was drawn from work that Ruth May, the chief nurse, has been doing to ensure that this is what happens. Yeah.
We now come to Daphne Elphick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Loneliness, isolation, these have been the constant companions of many over these last few weeks. So I warmly welcome social bubbles to help ease that loneliness and isolation. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking my constituents, Tracy Carr of Talk It Out, Beverly Jane Last of Super Neighbours, and the occupational therapist, Justine Norris, who have been working tirelessly over the last few weeks to help support the mental health and well-being of so many people at home during this pandemic.
Yes, my honourable friend speaks movingly of the support that so many have given, and her three constituents who she names deserve all of our praise for the work that they've done, along with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of others, to support those who have been living alone, whether it's the 2.2 million people who are shielding because they're clinically extremely vulnerable, or the over 8 million people who live on their own and therefore have during lockdown have had to stay on their own. This has been a very difficult time for many, and I pay tribute to the community's spirit and the support for others that so many have demonstrated.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The link between poverty and poor mental health is well understood. And as COVID easings continue, we face the prospect of an economic depression, the likes of which we've not seen since perhaps the 1930s. And ahead looms the potential of a post-COVID mental health pandemic. Can I ask the Secretary of State what specific and additional resources is he prepared to commit to alleviate this?
Well, nobody wants to see the sort of economic consequences that we've seen already, even if there are more to come. But we do have to take these measures in order to tackle this pandemic. We have put in extra support into mental health, and there is more to come. It's a really important part of the solution.
Richard Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the first opportunity I've had on behalf of my constituents to thank publicly the Secretary of State, his ministerial team, the entire civil service team and all their families for what they have contributed in this national effort, and I'd like to thank him and through him all that work with him. The local authorities in Bedfordshire have the highest incident rates of coronavirus across the east of England. Now, the Secretary of State did in his statement say that the processes are in place to escalate concerns if there needs to be a local lockdown, but there are local concerns about the availability of local data. Can you advise me what is the current state of localised data and what efforts he's trying to make to improve that availability?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is localised data available through the work of Public Health England, local directors of Public Health, including the Director of Public Health for Bedfordshire, and then the survey data that we put in place, although that is stronger at a national level than it is at a regional and again at a local level. Pulling all this data together and then ensuring it gets to the decision makers so that they can make decisions based on it is the task of the Joint Biosecurity Centre. And I will ask the head of the Joint Biosecurity Centre to write to him with the details of what data they have on Bedfordshire and what further data they are working on in order to be able to answer the questions that he rightly raises.
Heading to Ealing with James Murray. James Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Health Secretary confirm that in May his department wanted local councils to have local outbreak plans ready for June the 1st, but the councils had to ask them to make the deadline later this month because his department had been so late in asking them?
I don't recognise that, no.
We now come to Edward Timpson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The nation's health recovery and the important strides made in recent weeks gives us an opportunity as well as responsibility to leave no stone unturned in our drive for economic recovery. And to that end, would my right honourable friend agree with me that the regeneration of Winsford Town Centre, the building of the Women's Football National Centre of Excellence and the reopening of the Beeston Tarpey Railway Station are all projects in Eddisbury that a go-getting government can now get on and deliver?
Yes, absolutely. Given the economic consequences of the pandemic, it's absolutely vital that we get on with these go-getting economic projects, and I wish my honourable friend well in his support of them, and I wish everybody involved in them well in delivering.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Test, trace and isolate is obviously key to stopping a second wave, particularly in England, where lockdown has been relaxed at quite the rate. Is it not therefore a little bit shambolic that the government's flagship app is still only available on the Isle of Wight?
Yeah.
No.
Laura Ferris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by congratulating my right honourable friend on the successful rollout of dexamethasone. But my question is about international comparison. We were one of the later countries to be hit by the virus. There are others who have begun the process out of lockdown ahead of us. What country does my right honourable friend see as the paradigm for the United Kingdom, and what steps, if any, are we taking to share information with our healthcare professionals to emulate best practice?
Well, this is a great question, and we look all the time for countries around the world that we can learn from. It's true that in terms of where we were on the epidemiological curve, we went into lockdown before many European countries, before Germany and Spain and Italy, with lower cases per million. But we still learn from them. For instance, one of the lessons from Germany is a massive testing regime is incredibly important, and we now have a much bigger testing regime than Germany, which is terrific, and we've built that up. We also look to the Far East, which, with their lessons from SARS and MERS, which they learnt more directly, they have the contact tracing, which we are putting in place. So we're constantly learning, and that is probably the single most important thing that we can do through this crisis, is constantly to be looking around the world for places where we can learn best practice and then implement it here.
Going to South Yorkshire with Clive Betts. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Secretary of State will be reassured that the HCLG Select Committee on Monday, we heard from representatives of the Local Government Association and Directors of Public Health that relationships and coordination between the local level and the centre on testing, tracing and contacting people had substantially improved. But two concerns were raised. First of all, the number of people who were testing positive and refusing to give details of their contacts. Shouldn't we actually bring penalties in to try and ensure that happens? And secondly, people who then were contacted after tracing them but didn't want to isolate. Recognising that people can lose substantial amounts of income in this situation, shouldn't we bring in something like the furlough scheme to recompense people who can lose financially by isolating themselves?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, on the 3 points he raises, firstly, we have put a huge amount of effort into ensuring the local to national links are strong in test and trace, and I pay tribute to Tom Riordan, the Chief Executive of Leeds City Council, who's come into the programme on secondment from Leeds in order to deliver those links, and he's done an absolutely brilliant job, and I pay tribute to him. The second point he raises on mandatory contact tracing, we don't rule that out, but we want to get the system up and running, and it would be far better if it worked on a voluntary basis in the first instance. On the third point that he raises, we have put in place more support to ensure that people get the financial support they need to be able to do the right thing. The evidence is that the vast majority of people do, but of course we keep this under review.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join my right honourable friend in welcoming the tremendous news on treatment with dexamethasone. Following on from that, could he update the House on, firstly, what progress we are making towards a vaccine, and secondly, what progress we're making to our manufacturing capacity for the vaccine, so that when we do get the vaccine, we're able to roll it out at speed, including with Cobra Biologics in my constituency of Newcastle-under-Lyme.
I'm absolutely determined that should a vaccine come through, we're able then to roll it out in the first instance to those who are most vulnerable, right across the UK, including to his constituents in Newcastle. And that is incredibly important. As I said in my statement, AstraZeneca have now signed the contract to manufacture the vaccine, even ahead of the successful conclusion of clinical trials, which shows confidence. And the Imperial vaccine, which is not as far ahead as the Oxford vaccine, but it is promising, and it's based on a different vaccine technology, which is important. We want slightly different. That has gone into human trials as well.
McLaughlin.
Speaker, the findings of the PHE report into the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on black and minority ethnic people are or should be embarrassing, but they should be collectively embarrassing. So if we agree not to point the finger, if we all take our share of the blame for the structural racism that so very clearly exists, can we stop denying it, stop making excuses for it and start working together to dismantle it? And can we do it quickly, because people have rightly had enough?
Speaker, I agree with every word that the Honourable Lady says.
Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join my honourable friend with celebrating this best of British treatment that we are getting. But does he also share my concerns that not everyone is going to the NHS that needs to, things like cancer and A&E? And will he join with me in telling the people of Rother Valley to say, if they need treatment, please go to Rotherham Hospital, please go to the NHS, please get treated?
My honourable friend is quite right. The NHS is open, and if people need NHS treatment, then please come forward. And if people are asked or advised by a clinician to go to hospital, then please do that.
The A&E as well. Chian Mara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absent a vaccine, the key to unlocking our economic and our social lives is an effective test, trace and isolate system. The app, which can really help save lives, is behind schedule. So can he update us on the Isle of Wight trial, and specifically whether it has raised issues with the technology on Apple and or Android phones, and also the levels of take-up, and an idea as to when it will be more widely available?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as well as being a huge enthusiast for the A&E in Chorley, I'm also, and working on that, Mr. Speaker, I'm also a huge enthusiast for the use of technology. And the number one lesson we learnt from the Isle of Wight was that it is important to get the human contact first and use the technology to underpin the human contact tracing. And what's interesting is one of the things that we're learning is that to persuade people to isolate, it's obvious really, a human contact, a phone call with a real person on the other end, is the best way to do it. And we have a much higher number of contact tracers per head of population in this country now than almost any of our comparators.
And we're pleased he's a fan of Chorley A&E, so we look forward to it opening very shortly. Flake Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the psychological first aid training that the Right Honourable Friend launched this week so that frontline workers can support people with mental health problems? However, I'm also concerned about the mental health of key workers themselves, particularly those in the NHS, who have been working non-stop since January, many with last-minute rota changes and no prospect of a break soon. Could my Right Honourable Friend outline what we're doing to support key workers at this difficult time?
Yes, my Honourable Friend makes an incredibly important point, which is that the mental health of key workers, including those working in the NHS and in social care, is incredibly important. And one of the things we put in place in the crisis is a hotline and that support that I think should have been there long before, frankly, and we will maintain for as long as is possible, because it's just so important to support the physical and the mental health of the carers who care for us.
In order to allow the safe exit, honourable members that have been participating in the item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.